January 1st, 1945, New Year's Day. While Allied pilots were nursing hangovers from their celebrations the night before, 900 German fighter planes were silently taking off in the pre-dawn darkness. Within 3 hours, most of them would never return. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even close. This was Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's final desperate gamble in the West, and one of the most catastrophic military disasters in aviation history. The Luftwaffe bet everything on one morning. They lost. Today we're uncovering why Hitler's Air Force launched the largest single-day aerial assault of World War II, how they managed to keep 900 planes hidden from Allied intelligence, and why this operation didn't just fail, it destroyed Germany's ability to defend its own skies. This is the story of the morning Germany's Air Force committed suicide. Let me paint you a picture of where Germany stood at the end of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes, had just begun 3 weeks earlier. German tanks had punched through American lines, creating chaos and panic. For a brief moment, it looked like Germany might actually turn the tide. But there was one massive problem: the weather. Hitler had specifically launched the offensive during a period of terrible weather because he knew the Allies controlled the skies. As long as clouds covered the battlefield, German troops could advance without being strafed and bombed by Allied aircraft. But everyone knew the weather wouldn't last forever, and when those clouds cleared, Allied fighter bombers would tear the German advance to pieces. The Luftwaffe's leaders understood this with crystal clarity. They needed to do something dramatic, something unprecedented. They needed to destroy Allied air power on the ground before it could destroy their armies in the Ardennes. Enter Operation Bodenplatte. The plan was audacious, almost insane, in a single coordinated strike at dawn on New Year's Day, when Allied pilots would likely be exhausted from celebrations. Nearly 900 German fighters would attack 16 Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France. Not just attack them, obliterate them. Destroy hundreds of Allied planes while they sat parked on runways. Decapitate Allied air supremacy in one devastating blow. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, personally championed this operation. He promised Hitler it would change everything. But here is what is chilling. Many of the German pilots who would fly this mission didn't believe it would work. Some commanders openly protested. They argued that the Luftwaffe couldn't afford to lose even a handful of experienced pilots, let alone risk hundreds in a single operation. They were overruled. The mission was on. So how do you hide 900 aircraft from the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world? The Germans knew that Allied intelligence was constantly monitoring radio traffic, tracking plane movements, interrogating prisoners. If word of Bodenplatte leaked, the element of surprise would evaporate. So they implemented security measures that were genuinely impressive. First, radio silence, absolute, total radio silence. Pilots weren't told about the mission until the very last moment. Some received their briefings just hours before takeoff. Squadron commanders were briefed separately, and even they didn't know the full scope until late December. Information was compartmentalized so thoroughly that if you were captured, you couldn't reveal what you didn't know. Second, they scattered the aircraft, rather than concentrating planes at a few bases where Allied reconnaissance might notice unusual activity. German fighters were dispersed across dozens of small airfields. To any observer, it looked like business as usual. Third, they planned the mission during what they knew would be a vulnerable moment for the Allies. New Year's Eve 1944 was going to be a big celebration. Allied pilots had been fighting hard during the Battle of the Bulge, and they deserved a break. The Germans were counting on hangovers, on reduced alertness, on that one morning when defenses might be just a little bit softer. The flight path was carefully choreographed. Since many German pilots were inexperienced, the Luftwaffe had been hemorrhaging veteran aviators for years. They would follow more experienced pilots who knew the routes. They would fly low to avoid radar. They would maintain radio silence until the very moment of attack. On paper, it was brilliant, but here's what the planners didn't fully consider. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was running on fumes, literally and figuratively. Fuel was desperately scarce. Experienced pilots were even scarcer, and the Allies weren't quite as unprepared as the Germans hoped. New Year's Day, 1945, 8:20 a.m., the first wave of German fighters came in low over Allied airfields, engines screaming at bases across Belgium and the Netherlands. Shocked Allied personnel looked up to see Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs roaring overhead at near treetop level, cannons blazing. At some fields, the surprise was total. At Eindhoven, the Germans caught dozens of British Typhoons parked in neat rows. They strafed them methodically, explosions rippling across the tarmac. Planes erupted in flames. Fuel trucks exploded. For 15 minutes, it looked like the operation might actually succeed. The airfield at Metz-Freskety was hit hard. At Brussels-Ever, German fighters destroyed multiple aircraft and killed several Allied personnel on the ground. At Asch in Belgium, the Germans achieved near-complete surprise and wreaked havoc. But here's where things started going catastrophically wrong for the Luftwaffe. First, Allied anti-aircraft defenses were far more robust than German intelligence had realized. The moment those fighters came in low, they flew into a wall of flak. Tracers filled the sky. German planes started dropping like FLIs. Remember, these weren't high-altitude bombing runs where you could drop your payload and escape. These were low-level strafing runs where you had to stay exposed, vulnerable, flying straight through murderous ground fire. Second, many airfields had been moved or had different layouts than German intelligence photos showed. Some pilots couldn't even find their assigned targets. They circled, burning precious fuel, trying to orient themselves while Allied gunners opened up on them. Third, and this is the big one, Allied radar actually had picked up unusual activity. While the Germans maintained radio silence, Allied radar operators noticed large formations moving west. Some Allied squadrons had already been scrambled before the attack even began. At several airfields, Allied fighters were in the air when the Germans arrived. The result was chaos. German fighters that had come to strafe parked planes suddenly found themselves in dogfights with Spitfires and Tempests. And here's the bitter irony, many of those German pilots were inexperienced. They'd been thrown into front line service after abbreviated training because the Luftwaffe was so desperate for pilots. Now they were in close quarters air combat with some of the best fighter pilots in the world. The sky became a killing field. But the worst part, Germany's own anti-aircraft gunners started shooting down their own planes. Think about that for a moment. You're a German flak gunner stationed near the front lines. You have been trained to shoot at anything that moves because Allied aircraft have been pounding German positions for months. Suddenly, at low altitude, you see fighters racing overhead. In the split second, you have to decide. You don't know these are Luftwaffe aircraft returning from the raid. You open fire. Multiple German pilots were killed by their own flak batteries. It was the ultimate nightmare of friendly fire, and it happened because of how effective the radio silence had been. The German air defense network hadn't been informed about Bodenplatte. They were kept in the dark for security reasons, and it cost dozens of pilots their lives. Making matters worse, weather conditions deteriorated. As the morning went on, fog rolled in over parts of the front. German fighters, already low on fuel from the long flight to their targets, now had to navigate back through poor visibility. Some simply got lost. Others ran out of fuel and had to crash land or bail out over Allied-held territory. At Grimbergen Airfield, German fighters achieved significant success, but the commander of the unit, Oberstleutnant Alfred Druschel, was shot down and killed by Allied anti-aircraft fire. At Asch, despite initial success, the attacking force suffered heavy casualties. Squadron after squadron reported devastating losses. By noon, it was clear. Operation Bodenplatte wasn't a tactical victory. It was a disaster. Let's talk numbers, because they're staggering. The Luftwaffe committed roughly 900 aircraft to Operation Bodenplatte. By the end of the day, somewhere between 270 and 300 of those planes were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. About 230 pilots were killed, captured, or missing. Read that again. In a single morning, Germany lost nearly a third of the aircraft committed to the operation and over 200 pilots. And who were these pilots? They weren't just any pilots. Many were flight instructors, experienced aviators who'd been pulled from training schools because the Luftwaffe was so desperate. Killing them didn't just cost Germany planes, it cost the Luftwaffe its future. Without experienced instructors, new pilots couldn't be properly trained. The pipeline of aviators already barely flowing dried up almost completely. On the Allied side, yes, they lost planes. Estimates suggest around 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. That sounds like a lot. But here's the crucial difference. The Allies could replace those planes in a matter of weeks. American factories were churning out aircraft at an incomprehensible rate. British production was robust. Replacement aircraft were already on ships crossing the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe couldn't replace anything. Germany's fuel situation was desperate. Their factories were being bombed around the clock, and you can't build experienced pilots in a factory. Perhaps the most damning statistic, within 2 weeks of Operation Bodenplatte, the Allied air forces were back to full operational strength. The Luftwaffe never recovered. From January 1945 onward, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished as a fighting force capable of meaningful operations. So what went wrong? Why did an operation that looked good on paper turn into such a catastrophe? First, intelligence failure. German reconnaissance was good, but not good enough. They didn't fully understand how strong Allied anti-aircraft defenses had become. They overestimated how much surprise they'd achieve. They underestimated how quickly Allied fighters could scramble. Second, resource desperation. The Luftwaffe was already on its knees. Committing 900 aircraft to a single operation was reckless when they couldn't afford to lose even 50. It was a gambler doubling down when they should have been cutting their losses. Third, strategic miscalculation. Even if Bodenplatte had worked perfectly, even if they destroyed 500 Allied planes with minimal German losses, it still wouldn't have changed the outcome of the war. Germany was being crushed from the east by Soviet armies and from the west by Allied forces. Destroying a few hundred planes wouldn't stop that. But here is the deeper tragedy. Operation Bodenplatte revealed just how divorced from reality Hitler's high command had become. They were planning grand operations when they should have been thinking about how to minimize losses and preserve forces. They were dreaming of decisive victories when the war was already lost. Göring sold Hitler on a fantasy, and hundreds of young pilots paid the price. Behind every statistic is a human story. Take Oberstleutnant Alfred Druschel, the commander I mentioned earlier. He was an experienced pilot, a veteran of years of combat. On the morning of January 1st, he led his squadron against Grimbergen airfield. They achieved surprise, destroyed multiple Allied aircraft, but on the way out, Allied anti-aircraft fire caught his plane. He crashed and died. His squadron lost for other pilots, or consider the young pilots, fresh from training, some with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, who were thrown into this operation. Many had never seen combat before. They took off in the darkness, followed more experienced pilots to targets they'd never seen, fought their first air battle, and never made it home. The tragedy isn't just that they died. The tragedy is that their deaths accomplished nothing. Operation Bodenplatte didn't save the armies in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge would fail within weeks. It didn't buy Germany time. It didn't change the strategic situation. It just killed hundreds of men for no meaningful gain. And perhaps most heartbreaking, many of these pilots knew. They knew the war was lost. They knew. This operation was a desperate gamble. But they flew anyway because orders were orders, because their comrades were flying, because they still believed in something, even if that something was just not letting their friends down. Operation Bodenplatte stands as a testament to the desperation of Germany's final months. It was audacious, well-planned in some ways, and doomed from the start. In 3 hours on a cold January morning, the Luftwaffe effectively ended itself as a meaningful fighting force. The skies over Germany would belong to the Allies from that point forward. Bomber formations would fly with impunity. Allied fighters would strafe German columns without serious opposition. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war, was reduced to scattered remnants. When you look at the grand sweep of World War II, Operation Bodenplatte is easy to overlook. It happened during the larger Battle of the Bulge. It didn't involve the dramatic turning points of Stalingrad or D-Day, but in its own way, it's just as revealing about why Germany lost the war. By January 1945, Germany's leaders were ordering operations that made no strategic sense, burning through irreplaceable resources in futile gestures, sacrificing men who could have been used more effectively elsewhere. They were playing at grand strategy when they should have been facing reality. 900 fighters took off that morning, fewer than 700 made it back, and the ones that did return found themselves in an air force that no longer had the fuel, the planes, or the pilots to continue fighting. Operation Bodenplatte wasn't just a failed attack. It was the morning Germany's air force vanished from history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button. We've got more untold stories from World War II coming your way, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Operation Bodenplatte before today? What other forgotten battles should we cover? Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the famous battles. Sometimes the most revealing moments are the ones that have been forgotten.